Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is our biggest crowd so far for TideTalks, and we are ecstatic. Danny and I started this about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, to bring a lot of the great research that we were hearing through our time at Marine Lab or our time with a lot of the marine faculty, both on main campus and Marine Lab. And we just wanted to share some of that awesome research, but we understood that not everyone has time to take a marine science class or to fit it into their schedule, but there is still this vast interest in the subject. So we kind of wanted to have this space to be a little informal and just have everyone get to know a little bit about what's going on here at Duke and with all the amazing marine faculty.
Yeah, so once again, thanks for coming. We've got a really special speaker for you guys today. You have the opportunity to now listen about right whales from a world-leading scientist in marine mammal conservation. He's been at Duke now for 28 years. He's published over 250 papers, been cited over 20,000 times. He's the distinguished Stephen A. Toth Professor of Marine Biology here. He's the director of the Duke Marine Lab. He's running quite the show down there. If you guys haven't been down there, I was there this summer. It's absolutely amazing. Hope you guys can get down there. He's had many recognitions for his whole career. Recently, he's been awarded by President Biden to be on the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission, which is really sweet. But please put your hands together for Dr. Andy Reid.
Guys for organizing, and thank you for running the show. Thank all of you for coming. I expected there would be like 8 people here, so this is awesome. I will just say something at the beginning in my role as director of the Marine Lab. We welcome everybody to come and visit. You don't have to come for a semester. You don't have to come take classes. There are lots of opportunities to come down, and if you ever want to come down for a weekend or something, just email me. We'll make it happen. So it's a really welcoming place. We have a lovely community of scholars there. It's a great place to stay and it's great to see all the Marine Lab scholars here. Only to see so many familiar faces and a whole bunch of people too. So I really pondered what I should talk to you all about tonight, and I thought something local, something important, something current, and so the right whale conservation issue kind of came to the forefront. It's an issue that is really bubbling up at the moment. There are some pivotal decisions that government agencies will have to make in the coming months that will determine the trajectory of this population. I think you'll be able to watch in the news, but it's interesting being on the inside of some of those discussions. And I'll give you some insight into exactly what those deliberations are like. So this is the species we're talking about, the North Atlantic right whale. One of 3 species of right whales, one in the Pacific, one in the Southern Hemisphere. And as Melville said, this is the first species of whale ever to really be hunted by humans, with harvest going back into the Basque Country in France and Spain back into the 14th century, so a long, long time ago. It's called the right whale because it was the right whale. It's large, had a lot of blubber. Blubber was valuable for oil, had a lot of baleen in its mouth. The baleen was used in the world before plastics as a material that's pliable and strong. And importantly, the animals were relatively slow moving and they floated when they were dead. So they were a good species for the early whalers with relatively primitive technology to harvest. In North America, the Basques first came across in the 1500s. Basque fishermen came across to fish for cod off Newfoundland, and they noticed all these whales, and they told their family members when they went back to Spain and France. And soon the Basques were sailing across each year to harvest right whales, bowhead counts, which is a definitely northern California. The Basques were meticulous record keepers, so we have very good records of how many whales were harvested. And it's likely that that very early harvest knocked the population down from what we think was its original population size, which might be in the tens of thousands of animals, down to the current, something close to the current very small population size. Whaling for right whales was important locally on our coast, the North Carolina coast. This is the county seal of Carteret County where Beaufort is, where the Marine Lab is, and there are 2 right whales in the county seal. And local people who lived in Carteret County would sit out on Jackford banks. Those of you who've been down close to being at the shack. And they would wait for right whales to swim by on their northern migration from the breeding grounds back up to the feeding grounds. And they would row out in small boats, harpoon the animals, kill them, drag them back to shore, and try out the oil and take the bait. And this was a very important economic activity for local whalers. Each whale was worth, even in those early times, thousands and thousands of dollars. And so each whale was named. So the whaleflower name, sorry, the Mayflower whale, the little children whale, which was harvested by a bunch of kids. But there's the stories about each whale. Some of these whales still live on today, the Mayflower whales in the museum in Malawi, Scotland. And this low level of harvest probably kept the population pretty suppressed for periods of a couple hundred years. So now, right whales are living in a very different environment. So they breed down here off the coast of Florida and Georgia, and the first moms of the year will probably soon be making their way down to Florida to give birth. And then they migrate in this corridor up along the U.S. East Coast to feeding grounds in New England and Eastern Canada. And they live in what's really an urban ocean. And so there's a famous book describing North Atlantic right whales called Urban Whale. So they migrate past New York Harbor, past Baltimore, past Norfolk. Even their breeding grounds, as I'll show you down here, have really important busy ports like Jacksonville. So these are really whales living in an urban ocean. And as we look forward in time to think about what the world's oceans are going to look like, how whales are going to accommodate human activities, this is kind of what we imagine that in a lot of parts of the world whales will be facing. So I'm going to give a talk on Monday to the World Wildlife Fund in DC, trying to encourage WWF to step up and get involved in this activity. They have a whole theme of corridors and whales using migratory corridors. And my pitch to them is this is a corridor, but it's an urban corridor. Imagine like being in Florida, getting on I-95 and driving up there. It's kind of what it's like to right whale. Right whales are also one of the species we're seeing immediate effects of climate change. In 2017, the summer distribution shifted from the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy to the Gulf of St. Lawrence up here in Eastern Canada. And we had a lot of protective measures in place in U.S. waters and in the Bay of Fundy, but no protective measures in place in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So we lost about 17 whales that year due to entanglement of fishing gear and ship strikes. Canadian government's been very quick to respond. Protective measures are in place, but it's a good example of how the distribution of species can shift quickly and more quickly than we anticipate it will, and put those species into conflicts with humans that we don't anticipate. We've seen the same thing on the West Coast with humpback whales when we had the heat wave. Humpback whale distribution shifted inshore, and all of a sudden we had a ton of entanglements and invention of cattle. So as we think about the impacts of climate change, it's not just on prey, it's not just on the animals themselves, it's how they respond to the environment. And those animals moving into places where they may come into conflict with human activities that we don't anticipate. So this is an infographic from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the federal government agency of the Department of Commerce that's responsible for managing whales and dolphins in the U.S. So we believe that there are now fewer than 350 individuals in the population. We know every whale, but this we can identify the whales based on the patterns of curiosities. If you were in trivia, you got that first question on their heads. New England Firm in Boston maintains a catalog of individuals. We track these individuals through time. Almost every individual's genotype, so we know lineages, you know, whose mom was who, whose grandma was who. And we're really good at keeping track of the population on an annual basis. The problem with right whales is we're killing more of them each year than are being born. This is the number of births each year. Last year we had a pretty good year. We had 12 babies born off the waters of Florida and Georgia. But we killed about 30 in entanglement and fishing gear and ship strikes. We, on average, recover about 8 dead whales a year, but another 20 or so are lost and we never see them. Mostly animals that are entangled in gear and die offshore. And a population of 350 individuals just can't sustain a mortality level that high. The animals are long-lived, probably live for more than 100 years. They're very slow to mature. Females will give birth every 5 or 6 years. So they're very slow. Their life history is very slow, and they just can't sustain a very high level of mortality. So population has been in decline since 2010. And like I said, we're kind of in a crisis point now where we have to make some decisions about what we're going to do. We're going to continue to have right now. This is how NOAA imagines the work to conserve and recover. So for recovery to occur, we need to address the two primary threats. And those are vessel strikes, or animals that are killed by collisions with ships, and entanglement and fishing gear. I'll talk about those things. Then there are a whole bunch of potential and emerging threats, climate change, certainly, possibly wind energy development to talk to, or with government project WOW. That's where people are starting to think about potential for threats like that. And then we have a very active monitoring program, taking pictures of animals each year, monitoring animal health, and then trying to assess how well our conservation actions are really working. That's how it's supposed to work. So let's talk about the two primary threats. So these are large animals, like 50 feet long. They feed with a fairly primitive technique called ram filtration, which they open their mouths and they swim slowly through the water column, and they essentially sieve out, they filter out very small prey. They feed on calamari copepods, zooplankton about that big. And they feed on tens of thousands of them at a time. They have to have very dense aggregations of prey to make that feeding profitable. And they use their baleen, the plates of baleen that are suspended from their upper jaw as the sieve. So they swim through the water comes in their mouth and it goes out to the baleen, and they collect the zooplankton on the inside of their baleen. Every now and then they'll stop feeding and use their tongue to create a big bolus of copepods. But swimming through the water with your mouth open is a bad thing to do if there's a lot of fishing gear around you. And so the fishing gear we're most concerned about are trap fisheries, so lobster traps. There are a lot of other trap fisheries, including traps for fish. And typically, these traps have multiple traps on the bottom, and then a vertical line that goes to a buoy, so a harvester can recognize where her or his gear is. And it's these vertical lines really that are the threat, because the animal swimming through the water with its mouth open encounters one of these vertical lines, typically in the mouth. We know that the animal's response, if it does that, is typically to turn and twist, and that just makes it worse. And then you have a rapid line around the animal's head through the baleen, and then the animals are strong enough, they can swim off and carry this entire string of gear. I'll show you some videos so you can see what consequences that have. The severity of this problem is really exacerbated because modern line that is used in fisheries often has steel in it. And so fishers want really strong line that doesn't break. And the problem is that when whales entangled with that line, carrying a huge amount of gear, the weight of that gear will just cut through the tissue of the whale because the line is so strong. So more than 3/4 of the population have scars from past entanglements. Remarkably, a quarter of the population acquires new scars each year. We know this from the photographic records the folks from the aquarium and from NOAA. So we can actually look at the acquisition of new scars and new entanglements. And I'm not going to emphasize it now. You'll see it in the video, but some of my colleagues in the veterinary community refer to this as the most acute animal welfare issue with any wildlife community, because these animals can drag gear around for periods of a year or a year and a half before they slowly die. It's a really brutal time. Our immediate response to the entanglement, I'll talk about the longer term response, but our immediate response is to try and disentangle the rails, to try and get the gear off the rails. This is really dangerous work. A disentangler was killed in 2020 in Eastern Canada when a right whale brought its flukes down on that indigenous having killed. We all know, all of us are working with disentanglement network, and it's very dangerous. But we do our best. We have a whole series of specialized cutting tools that we can use to cut the gear off the animal without actually cutting into the tissue of the animal. And I'll show you some of that in the video in a second. So just to give you an example about how much work goes into one of these events. This was in January of this past year. It was a Friday. I was getting ready for the weekend. We got a call from the aerial survey team. This is flights that have come every good day looking for right whales in the southeast U.S. from the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And the North Carolina crew called us and said, "We have an entangled whale, Carolina Beach. Can you go and respond and do an assessment?" So we did. This is the farmer. There's a view and we're approaching this whale. They'd already identified the whale as a male with a 42-year sighting record. It was mature when it was first laid out. So it's a very old whale, an old male. And this is what the whale looks like. It's in poor condition. You can kind of see in the light diagram here that there's cyan as well lice all over the body of the whale, which is typically an indication the animal's in poor health. We suspected it had been entangled and carrying gear for quite a long time. This is where we first found the animal on the 27th of January. We tried to engage the whale that day. We got photos, we couldn't do anything else. We went back the next day. Typically what we do in the disentanglement world is apply satellite telemetry buoy to the trailing gear. It's a big buoy that has a satellite tag. We make that fast to the gear so the whale's not carrying this buoy as well. That allows us to reacquire the whale the next day and continue to follow it. We found the whale again the next day, the 29th. By this time, we had colleagues from Georgia, from Florida, and from NOAA with us to try and disentangle the whale. So this is one whale, right? And we've got 3 days, multiple agencies, tons of land. So I'm just going to show you this video. So this is the first day. Sounds off, so you're not going to hear all the swearing. These guys from Georgia DNR. There's the V-shaped globe, typical diagnostic picture of the right whale. And what we're trying to do here is to grapple a line, the whale's trailing line. We want to grapple into that line so that we can get a hold of the line that the whale is trailing. This is hard. We failed the first day, but these guys are really good. And they actually were able to grapple the line. And then now you see it again, and then put the boat in the gear. And that allows us to put the telemetry buoy on. The next day we come back. This is video, underwater video that Zach Swain from my lab took. These are two very large lobster pots that the animal's been dragging for almost 2 months. This is January, end of January. These lobster pots are actually marked, and I can tell you where they came from in a second. So this shows you actually how we go back and cut the line off. So we're approaching, this is the most dangerous part of the process, we're approaching the whale's tail. And that's what we refer to as the kill zone. You don't typically want to go in. But you'll see how badly embedded that line is around the flukes of the whale. And all this here is necrotic tissue, and the line is just cut into the tail stalk of the whale. Whales typically swim by moving their flukes up and down. This whale was in so much pain and pain that it was unable to move its flukes, and it was just sculling using its petrol. You can see how nasty that is. Right whales are famous for being very, very aggressive when you try and disentangle them. This old male basically sat there and let us cut the gear off. And we knew what we were doing, and we kept inspecting him because it must have been painful for us to be pulling that gear off his tail. You can see how badly the teeth it is there. But he just let us do it. And it was kind of a remarkable experience. None of us had ever experienced a whale let us do this before. The veterinarians we talked to said that if the line had not got into the bone, the tailstock, there's a chance that the animal would survive. We were able to get all the gear off. You'll see the final cut here in a second. And so the animal had a chance. The animal's not been seen since, so we don't know whether he's alive or not. So this is pulling the gear off after we freed it from the whale. You can see how little work I'm doing. Old guy. Zach, let me give you a hand. That looks really heavy. I'll just step back. So here are the two lobster pots. So these are from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the fisherman who owns these lobster pots, the pots, this is the whale swimming away. See, it's not eating food at all. The lobster fisherman reported his entire string of 15 traps missing on December the 7th. So the whale had swam off with all 15 traps. Come from Nova Scotia all the way down to North Carolina. And by the time we got to him, we only had 2 of those traps left. But that gives you a sense of both of the conservation aspect of this, and it probably killed that whale, but also the animal welfare implication. That's an awful thing to do to an animal. It's a horrible way to slowly kill an animal. The way we deal with this from the conservation side is that NOAA has convened what they refer to as the Take Production Team. The Marine Mammal Protection Act has a provision such that if more marine mammals are killed in a fishery than are allowed under sustainable biology reference points, one of these teams is formed, and the teams operate by consensus. They try and find ways to modify fishing practices to reduce the number of whales killed. This team's been meeting for a long time. They have a really hard job, and they haven't done much. In 2022, when it became clear that the population was declining pretty steadily, Noah said to the team, okay, we need to find additional ways to reduce mortality and serious injury of these whales in all commercial fisheries in the US, less than 1 per year. And now we're probably trying 15 or 20. So a 90% reduction in this, and an additional 40 to 50% reduction in this beyond what the team did to in 2021. And the fishing community is like, we cannot do any more. We're doing as much as we can unless we fundamentally change the way in which we fish. And that's what those of us in the science community and conservation community have said. You need to fundamentally change the way you fish. Rather than having each trap have a vertical line, each trawl of traps, like 10 traps or 15 traps, on a vertical line at each end. We've developed, the marine technology industry developed, this is the typical way to fish. A new system in which you can use acoustic modems. So you set your pots on the bottom, you use an acoustic modem when you want to retrieve them, you set a sound down to the trap receives that sound, and then either the pop-up buoy or inflatable bag, something that will lift that pot up in the surface. So there are no vertical lines in the water at all. So from a technological perspective, we can do this now. Just had a meeting of the Rutgers Consortium a couple of weeks ago in Halifax, Nova Scotia. 400 people attending, lots of developers. Technology is there. We still have some things to solve. How enforcement agencies can access this system. What happens in very high density areas? If any of you have ever been on the coast of Maine in summertime in places like Camden, there are lobster pots everywhere. This system's probably not going to work. We're going to work in places where the gear is less dense. And then we need to get the cost down. We need to get the cost down, and we need the industry to adopt it. So we were pushing very hard on ropeless. And then in December, when President Biden was trying to push through the omnibus spending bill through Congress, Senators Collins and King, in return for their vote to approve the omnibus spending bill, which basically funds our entire government, said, we'll agree to vote for your bill, President Biden, if you put a rider on the bill such that the Maine lobster industry doesn't have to do anything to address right whale entanglement for the initially asked for 10 years. And then Senator Schumer talked them down to 6 years. So now we have a 6-year pause during which we cannot do legally anything to the Maine lobster industry to deal with this particular issue. It's a bad thing. We can talk about the politics and Q&A afterwards. It actually gives us a period of time to, I think, overcome some of the burdens. So now we have until 2028 to do this. So this is, again, this is a NOAA infographic. This step is done. We've developed technology that works. Demonstrated it works. It works in lots of different environments. Now we need to do things like resolving gear conflict. So typically, if you're, for example, dragging a trawl net through an area, you can see where the lobster pots are because lobster gear is because they've got floats. In this system, you wouldn't have that. So if you're a trawl fisherman, you also need to know where the floats are. So you need to have a system on your boat to say, okay, I can see these traps underwater. We can make that happen. It's just a question of making it happen. Okay. We need to actually get that out into and scale it up into the real world to make sure that it's going to work. And then we need to modify fishing plans, the federally mandated fishing plans to make sure that's going to happen. So 6 years is probably a reasonable timeline to do this. But I'll tell you that in Maine, where most of the lobster gear is, there's a huge amount of political opposition to actually doing this. So I'm bashing ahead. Okay, second issue, entanglement's the most important issue. Second issue is ship strikes. This is a baby right whale born off the coast of Florida. It was struck and killed by that vessel, which later sank after hitting the whale off the beach. So this is what we're trying to guard against. You can see the propeller marks here. So this animal bled out really quickly. This typically ship strikes, mortality is pretty quick. Just to show you, this is the conflict about this is like critical habitat declared under the United States Species Act. This is where the right ones give birth to their babies off in Florida. And this is just an AIS map showing you the density of ship, large ship vessels going in and out in places like Jacksonville. These animals are giving birth in a place where there's an enormous amount of ship travel coming. So what are we doing to deal with that? So we are, right now, NOAA has vessel speed rules in place. So here's one city between November and April, and then 20 nautical mile radius outside the entrance to the harbor into Beaufort Inlet. ships have to slow down to 10 knots or less. And that's designed to prevent ships from hitting right whales as they're coming in out of port. So there are all these seasonal zones up and down the coast. But that's still not preventing mortality. So this is a male, 20-year-old male that was struck and killed off Virginia Beach last weekend. So we know that the provisions that we have today are still not enough to prevent shipwreck mortality. So earlier this year, NOAA proposed expanding these ship speed rules, both in space, so basically blanketing the entire coast, and also very controversially, right now the rules only pertain to vessels that are 65 feet and longer. And now it's proposed going down to 35 feet in length and greater. There's an enormous number. If you come to Morehead City, there's an enormous number of like 40, 50, 60-foot sports fishing vessels that will be impacted by this rule. They are pissed off. They do not want to have to slow down. So there's a large amount of opposition. This is an article from Wilmington Papers, I think, just talking about the opposition within North Carolina to do that. All the senators from Florida, Georgia, South Carolina have written to President Biden saying, "You cannot do this. We must not do this." So it's going to be really interesting to see whether NOAA has the political will to actually take this measure through. We were expecting that they were going to announce the final rule before November 1st. They did. Now they're saying it'll be January. So it'll be interesting to see if they water it down. These are runs of what's known as a population viability analysis. It's a demographic model, a population model we use in conservation science to project out what populations will do under different scenarios. It allows us to do things like say, okay, what happens if we were able to reduce entanglement mortality by 50%? What would the population do? The model was just released. I was one of 3 peer reviewers who looked at this model. It's a really good model. So this is the baseline projection. This is what we think the population will do between now and 2100 if we don't do anything other than the measures we have in place today. And that means the population is just going to continue to slowly dwindle down to something less than 200. Right now, we have fewer than 50 reproductively active females. And so this will be a very small number of reproductively active females. And at that point, stochastic things can happen and you're really at risk of extinction. You get down to small numbers. If we could reduce entanglement by 25%, this is where we would go. But if we could reduce entanglement by 50%, the population will slowly recover. And that's what we want. That's going to mean the fishing industry adopting ropeless in a way that it really hasn't done today. I'm really happy to be able to tell you that there's a fishery off North Carolina, the Black Sea Bass Pot fishery. It was gone ropeless and it's working great. It's not a very big fishery, but it's just an indication that harvesters can do that if they give them incentives. I'm almost done. I'll just tell you, so we're in a mess with North Atlantic right whales. I think this year we have at least $80 million going to North Atlantic right whale conservation. We will never be able to spend that much money. It's one of the few conservation cases I've ever been involved in that we have more money than we need. We don't need $80 million. We need political wealth. We need political support. In the North Pacific, there's a tiny population of right whales, different species. And on the eastern population, there are probably fewer than 50. We don't know anything about them. We don't know where they go in the wintertime. I just had a PhD student in a right finish looking at stabilized hooks and baleen, trying to figure out where they might have gone based on the biogeochemical signatures in their baleen. You just don't know where they are in the wintertime. Zero funding for those things. And there's another species of large whale, it's hiding being good, Rice's whale in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, very small population, in a very highly organized industrial environment. Again, zero funding for that. On Thursday, I'm going to be at the Smithsonian for the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. We're making a big pitch for funding in Congress for this species and for license around the Gulf of Mexico. And we'll have a whole bunch of folks from Congress there, and maybe they'll listen to me a little more. If you're interested in learning more, this is a great book written by a friendly colleague of ours, Michael Moore from the Little Institution. It's a really good read. He's a veterinarian, and he sees things through the prism of veterinary medicine. There was a really wonderful documentary by some Canadian filmmakers called Map of the Right Whales. If you have a chance to see it's on the Nat Geo channel sometimes. You have a chance to see this because there's video there of a very recently entangled right whale in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And it's the most frightening thing I've ever seen. The whale has just got into gear, it's panicked, and it's thrashing in a way that like I've never seen a whale do before. And you want to like stay like miles away from that whale because it's so dangerous. Okay, 32. Good. That's it. I'm happy to take any questions if you want. And I will say, and I meant to say this at the beginning, every time I give a talk on right whales, I need to start by saying, like, it is not hopeless. We have lots of hope. It's just a question of political will. What we decide as a society we want to prioritize, right? Your generation, I want your kids to be able to see right whales. And so we need to make decisions now that will allow that to happen. All right, questions?
How does the 20 about 20 whales that are dying every year? Are they mostly older whales who have already like reproduced, or is it like a mix?
It's a mix. It's all over the place. Ship strikes typically tend to get younger animals and females. We think that that's because they spend a lot of time near the surface. The entanglements, everybody, with the exception of the very young. One of the really weird things in this population is that so when a whale shows up on the beach, like this animal, that animal, get it? A team of vets with very specialized skills will do postmortem on the animals to see what the cause of death is. And there are only about probably fewer than 5 vets who have the skill. You can imagine taking apart a 50, not using scalpels, using backhoes, front end loaders, and whaling instruments. So to your point, one of the weird things that we see with all the animals that are being examined at postmortem on the beach, we have no records of animals dying of natural mortality other than turning. So animals are definitely alive. So animals, we think these are very, very long-lived animals. Bowhead whales live for more than 200 years. You know that. These animals could easily live for 150 years if you didn't kill them. But we're killing them so fast they don't get to die. But it's all every age. And again, we only know minimum ages for these because we don't have, some animals we have sighting records to go back 40, 50, 60 years. But we don't know how old they were when they first departed.
So in one of your earlier graphs, it was was tracking the population, and from 2000 to 2010, it saw the population was going increasing, but then there was the dip.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any like cause that what changed in around 2010 where it started.
That's a really good question. Around here, NOAA, the agency responsible for right whales, gave a whole bunch of their staff awards because they'd saved the right whale. And a whole bunch of us were like, "Are you kidding us? Do not do that." So we think what happened is over time, as stronger gear and as whales change their distribution, the whales are becoming entangled now in gear that they just can't shed. And so the steel core line that's used is just it's a death. And some of it might be sarcastic, but we think that's it. But really, it doesn't look so precipitous because of the way that the scale is here. But this decline has been really, really strong. It's very.
What other ecosystem impacts have come from the right whale?
No, that's a good question. So the question is, so if we lost right whales, would we notice from anything else in the ecosystem? Probably not. They're very particular about their diet. They feed on this one species of copepod that they like. They like a particular life stage of that copepod that has lots of lipid in it. And we know a little bit about that copepod, but we don't know a lot about the interactions between whales and copepods and how important whales are as a driver of those copepods. Copepods are important food for lots of other things in the ecosystem. But like lots of other very endangered and imperiled animals, if you took right whales out of the system, we might not notice because there's so few of them. But if we could get right whales back to 10, 20,000 animals, what would that system look like? We don't know. That's, so our baseline is a weird baseline. We really need to go back hundreds and hundreds of years before we could find a place where there were lots of whales. So it's a very good question. We don't know. Yeah. In the white.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. Is there any sort of punishment for ships like striking shoal right now?
There's a punishment if you exceed the speed limit. And NOAA is very good at catching vessels doing that. They have a system in place where they use not just each large vessel has something called an AIS system, an automated identification system, in which they're a transponder that's currently saying, I am this vessel and running this speed, so NOAA can intercept that. But they also have systems on land that they can use to track ships if they can make this. So if you break that regulation, you are warned and you're fined. Yeah.
Is that anything to be used to
Yeah, a lot of it's going to roadless. And so here's where, like, fishing communities themselves, we need them to get on board, and we're talking about changing human behavior, which is always hard, and it varies from fishing community to fishing community. So like I said, the small Black Sea bass fishery in North Carolina, they're on board. They don't have to be restricted. Maine lobster, we had a meeting with Senator Collins' staff and Senator King's staff. Senator Collins' senior staffer said, until lobster year, we are not going to do anything to promote roadless, and we're going to actively oppose it. So that's the opposition. Massachusetts very different, and some fishers who are like, I'm going to get out ahead of this because it's coming, and I want to be able to use ropeless. And they're saying, let me go use ropeless gear in that area that's close to lobster fishing. I will show you what to do. Those are the guys we want to incentivize, let them make money, and then the rest of the can come along with it. Yeah.
Do you have any idea like what percentage of the boat strikings are from the smaller vessels?
That is a very good question. That was the House hearing earlier this summer where that exact question was asked by a congressman from Florida. We typically don't know. Typically what we have is a dead whale on the beach. The calf that died, this one, sorry, we knew was struck by this boat. When I get to it, sorry, because the boat sank, right? So that boat sank after hitting this wedge. That's a 42-foot boat. So that boat was not covered by the speed rule. They were running fast at night. There's no way they could have possibly seen the whale. They hit the whale, killed the whale, boat sank. So it's also a human safety issue for smaller vessels, which is the thing we can talk about. But typically, when we think about it, it's large ships, not small ships. Erin, you have a question on that?
I have a couple questions from the group at the Marine Lab. Is there any work being done to think about management of this species if they recover in the future?
So Dave Johnson, who's Marine Lab faculty, but up here, one of my best friends, likes to say, what on earth will we do if we recover right whales to the point where we have 15,000 of them? Because we'll be running into them all the time, and I look forward to having that problem. And it won't happen in my lifetime, and it probably won't happen in your lifetime because these animals reproduce so slowly. Right? Maybe your grandkids like that one for life. So that's a long-term problem where we don't have to think about it right now.
I have a second question from the group.
Hi, Marine Lab.
What progress has been made on the ropeless fishing gear, and when it's implemented, who will be responsible for paying for it?
That is a very good question. So there's a lot of progress on the technological side. There are 4 or 5 major technology developers that are working on it. But who's going to pay for it is a big question. My sense is that there's so much money now available, and we could get more money if we need it from Congress. So for a one-time subsidy of a lot of fisheries, we could probably pay for a lot of that, at least in the initial buying of gear. Still to be worked out, still in that 6-year time period we have between now and the time we can actually do something. Yeah. Literally, we're holding our fingers crossed. And we're hoping we don't have bad years. One of the things I haven't talked about very much, this is a transboundary issue because whales go into Canada and there's mortality of whales in Canada. Maine lobstermen will tell you correctly that a lot of the entanglements happen in Canadian waters, in lobster here and snowcrab here. Canadian government is much more top down. So the management in Canada is much more centralized. And the Canadian government can do things like close an area immediately. They don't have to go through the kind of Byzantine process. So they're more nimble than we are. And so far they've done a better job of responding than we have. But we're just like keeping our fingers crossed we don't have 6 bad years. So if we have 6 bad years, it might be.
About offshore wind.
Yeah.
Is there any that when the right now have like fun on the shore that has the development?
Right. Spend a lot of my time talking to reporters answering that exact question. Because at some point, Tucker Carlson on Fox News said that offshore wind energy is killing whales. Former President Trump then made that same point. So a lot of people who oppose wind energy on political grounds or whose lobbying efforts are paid for by the oil and gas industry will point to the fact that we have dead whales on the beach at the same time we're developing offshore. It is very clear, could not be any more clear about this, very clear that there's nothing that's happening in offshore wind development that has killed a single whale. The concern we have with offshore wind and right whales is not that somehow the construction of those farms is going to kill whales. Certainly, if there's more ship traffic to service those offshore wind turbines, that could be a problem. One of my brilliant master students at the Marine Lab, who hopefully listen to this, that's really key. Trying to figure out, is there more ship traffic associated with offshore wind development? How much is that? How much more of a risk is that going to be for whales? And then there's a more nuanced issue that if we have a lot of turbines in a particular area, those turbines are taking energy out of the wind, right? And we're taking that energy and using it for our own uses. What happens in that situation when that wind energy is no longer stirring up the water? What changes will that have for water circulation and for the potential for concentrating these little copepods in dense enough patches for the right whales to feed? So there's a National Academy panel that's looking at that question right now. They just released an interim report. So people are thinking about those questions. But when you hear offshore wind, stranded whales, you should just say bullshit. Yeah.
Do you see reverting to weaker breakable ropes as a viable alternative? And are you working that into the tech plan?
Yeah, so that's part of the existing take reduction plan. And I can tell you a lot about how we might construct those as part of our senior thesis. But yeah, so there are two things. One, can we use weaker rope, weaker line? Two, can we build things into that line so that when a whale becomes entangled, that the line would dissolve? You want to talk about your idea? Yeah.
So the idea is basically to see if we can take a rope and partially make it out of material. So that way, as it cuts into the skin of the whale, we can one like disintegrate. No, like it pushes a couple reactions. It's not reaction and that would break down and dissolve the portion of the road within enough where those really strong enough and so right now testing dissolving sutures, those already exist. So and then you use for this other things.
So the experiment survived 2 top performance so far. Well done. But that's a really good question. And so there have been attempts to put things like what are referred to as weak links in gear and use things like knots that will weaken the strength of the lines. So far, they have not proved very effective. And again, the difficulty here is if you're a harvester, right? If you're a fisher, you want strong gear. You don't want your gear to part as a storm or if you snag it on the bottom, because then you're going to lose your gear. So we're up against this thing that the fishermen want. If we can have ropeless gear, they can have the strongest gear they want. We don't care because whales won't become entangled. That's why we think it's always. Maybe one more question, and then we should let you guys show you one more. Yeah.
Are we seeing higher rate of ships like more than right whales in comparison to some of the other long-lived feline fish?
So the comparison we like to make is with South Atlantic, Southern African and Australian right whales. And we see much lower rates of entanglement and mortality in those areas because there are fewer ships and there's fewer rapid prop fisheries there. So their rates of scarring are much lower. The other thing we see, I haven't talked about it because I haven't had time, the frequency with which these whales become entangled has an adverse consequence on their health. You can imagine if you're dragging around here for half of the year, you're going to be in crappy condition. And these whales have to store enough energy, so the females store enough energy when they're feeding, so they can go down to the breeding grounds where they fast. They don't feed at all for months at a time. And what we're seeing when we compare North Atlantic right whales with Southern right whales, they're skinnier, they take longer to reach maturity, they take longer between reproductive events, just because they're continually stressed by dragging dairy, which is a problem. I'm happy to stay here and chat with you guys about this. Thank you all so much for coming. Continue to follow the story. Be active. Talk to your professional representative groups. Help us save the right. Thank you very much. Good. Wow.